Okay, hi everybody. Very warm welcome to Taylor Coble, who's joining us from San Francisco this afternoon for him. Hi.
Hello, thanks for having me, Sandy.
It's our pleasure. I'm going to launch straight in as usual to a pretty big question, I think. We've heard before that you studied painting and printmaking, and I'm very curious to find out in what way painting has influenced your photography.
Well, yeah, first and foremost, I think it's sort of influenced me in a way that I look at a photograph as it were a canvas or as it were a painting. But I think it's on a subconscious level. It's not like I'm out to try to capture a photograph that would emulate a painting. It's just I think that's the way my mind is wired to do so. And I think it benefits me because I think it gives me another angle than maybe a traditional photographer might have. And I think maybe that's why my photos are a little more esoteric, maybe in a way, than a more conventional photographer, so to speak. And so I think, there's a niche for it. There's certain people who really like my work that are passionate about it, but I'm not sure it would be openly embraced by the general populace, maybe, of those who really love and know photography.
Okay, I'm thinking though, as an extension or an accompaniment to painting, you very specifically studied printmaking. And I've
Correct.
noticed when I've looked at your photographs, there's definitely a sense of like layering and register in what you photograph. Do you want to talk a little bit about printmaking in context of being a photographer?
Yeah, printmaking is something I did sort of, it fell into my lap. It wasn't something I was planning on doing, but when I was in graduate school, I took a class, just an introductory class, and really liked it. And what I loved about printmaking was if you create an image that you really love, you can replicate it, unlike a painting.
Mm,
Meaning you can actually replicate the exact image. Rather, with painting, you've got to go back and try to recapture that painting again, and there's really only one that's original. Whereas with a print, you can do a series of them. And what I did were lithographs, and it just made me look at a particular medium of expression in a slightly different light, because it's a different path of expression than painting or photography.
mm.
And it made me think a little more minimalist. It made me concentrate on particular detail that I wouldn't in painting, because it's more drawing oriented than painting oriented. So I guess I was a little more conscious about the lines and the space, the use of negative space,
Yeah.
than I did with painting. And I think it brought something to, like, my artistic arsenal, if you will. It gave me another tool to work with, just another perspective. And I think it broadened my horizons just that much more by having gone through that process, I think.
It's interesting to hear you talking about something that's actually quite reductive when, I mean, to my eye, a lot of your photographs are kind of maximalist in so many ways. There's so much going on in your work. There are so many, as I said already, these layers. Perhaps the layers themselves, I guess, are maybe quite simple. But actually, when we look at the noisiness of your work,
Yeah.
uh, there's so much going on that's beyond something that's simplified. It is definitely a maximalist image. Would you agree?
I would agree with that assumption. Yeah. With that assessment, rather. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think the reason for that, there's a couple of things at play. One, I think um, I'm a little self conscious about my work, even though I put it out there. You would think, I wouldn't have any reservations of doing it. I actually do. I think maybe I'm afraid that some of it may be a little too boring or something. So to try to jazz it up a little bit, I think maybe I'm trying to put more in there to sort of capture the reader's attention a little bit more,
Okay.
to maybe compensate for a photograph that I don't think is quite up to par, to where I want it to be. So I just add a little pizzazz to it. And also, I think a lot of it is just me trying to capture my favorite city, New York City, because it is a place of just fast times, high energy, a lot of different facets of life going on, and I'm trying to capture that. I'm trying to emulate that, more or less, in a lot of my work. Trying to capture a feeling, trying to capture maybe music that's going on. Like on the corner, there's probably somebody busking on the corner, or somebody playing a soprano saxophone on the street, with their hat out, trying to scrape a buck. And I hear that in the background. I hear this car going by, and there's a horn blowing, and she's talking on her cell phone. Then you hear different voices and conversations going on. It's just, it's like I'm trying to capture like a controlled chaos
Mm.
in a way, trying to freeze that particular moment of chaos and trying to present it to the viewer where they can experience all that chaos, maybe without actually having to be in that chaos.
When I was planning my questions to meet with you, I was thinking very much about, as a viewer yourself of photographs, a consumer of photographs. This may be an impossible question, but if you didn't take these photographs yourself and you saw them, how would you analyze them?
I would definitely think that this artist has something to say. That this artist is interesting. I wouldn't say that he or she would be particularly conventional, um, and I don't necessarily mean that in a good or a bad way. I just think that it's a little different, maybe, than past works that I've seen, and it seems like there's a lot at play here. And I would wonder what maybe the photographer is trying to convey here. Are there like overt messages? Are there subliminal messages going on?
Mm.
Is it
Do you think
metaphor?
your work has got a particular, is it in any way gender driven? You know, does it have a masculinity, or is it kind of stateless in one way, in that cacophony of form and that noisiness? Is there something stateless about it?
I don't know. In terms of gender, I hope it's not gender oriented one way or the other. I would like to be neutral on that. I just try to capture what I find interesting. And if it does have like a gender slant to it, it's certainly not conscious at all.
I'm just going
And
to go back to my first slide. Um, you do, I mean, you've got photographs of everybody, you've got photographs of lots of different locations, but you do have an eye for a pretty lady, it's true.
oh, yeah, I guess I can't argue that. Yeah, I guess that's just innate in me. Ever since I was just a little boy, I guess I've been captivated by beautiful ladies. I've had a lot of beautiful ladies in my life. So maybe that influenced me. I mean, when I say that, I mean like just growing up, I feel like I was more or less taken care of by ladies. Like my mom was very beautiful. My grandmother, the neighbors next door, I was really close with. My two best friends growing up were girls. So I don't know. I look and I think I was sort of in touch with my feminine side. You might say, I think I was inspired in the arts and in the humanities by a lot of women in my life.
Mm.
So I sort of look at them with awe, I think, and maybe that translates into street photography for me, where I'm consciously maybe looking for what I find to be a beautiful lady because it's something I really admire and it's something I'm trying to capture on camera.
And in addition to that, do you think, you've mentioned your mum and your grandmother,
Yes.
there's also then a relationship with a different era, with something that belongs in the past?
Yes, very much so. I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people have commented on my photography that sort of has a vintage feel, or I'm trying to capture a different era. And I think that's definitely true. I was really influenced by my grandmother, who was born in 1919. And through growing up, I spent summers with her, and she was very influential, I think. Looking at her old life magazines or her photo albums, or watching
Mm.
classic black and white 1950s movies. I was introduced to a lot of film at a young age,
Yeah.
which I think influenced me actually more than photography. I think I've alluded to this earlier, but filmmakers and painters and musicians have influenced me a lot more than I would say traditional photographers. But yeah, I was influenced greatly by my grandmother, by different eras,
Mm.
and by music. I listened to a lot of swing music, jazz music, and I think I'm trying to channel the feeling, the sound of jazz and other types of music into my photography.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
I think in meeting all of the different photographers that I've been so fortunate to meet in the past few months since lockdown, um, something I've noticed quite a lot actually is a lot of photographers who are working in an urban environment always cite music as kind of like their primary influence, actually, that there's something connected between sight and sound that pushes a photographer into perhaps a very particular way of image making
I
that
think so.
other references wouldn't. I'm also just going to say now for especially any students watching this that a couple of weeks ago Taylor was actually interviewed by a fellow YouTuber called Charlie Pinder, and that interview is really brilliant, really full of lots of information, and there'll be many things I'm sure that we might refer to in this interview that I would be very grateful to Charlie Pinder for, because actually I can follow on from things that were asked there. But for the purposes of people who maybe don't know that interview already, could you just give us an idea again about the kind of process, your artist's process through working, listening to music?
Yeah, when I take these junkets to New York City, and by the way, New York City is not really my home base. I spend, I mean, most of my days outside of New York, outside of New York State. And I can get on to that later about why I think that's important for me as a photographer. But when I take these journeys into New York, I purposely will make particular playlists that are pretty thoughtful and sequenced in a particular way that I think will benefit me in my mood on the street. And I think it helps me channel a feeling I'm trying to go through. And it also, I think, informs the way I look through the lens, like what I'm looking for, or it helps me break through a barrier, helps me take a chance maybe that I wouldn't normally.
Mm.
It gives me like a false sense of security. It gives me some courage because contrary to what some people may believe, I'm actually kind of introverted and kind of shy. And I like when I'm just walking down the streets, I'm kind of shy when it comes to strangers. I'm usually not the first person to strike up the conversation. So it's often hard for me to take a photograph when people are conscious of me taking their photograph. They see that I'm taking a photograph. If I had I'm in my groove, so to speak, and I'm listening to music, and I'm in a certain mood, it gives me just this particular feeling or courage that I wouldn't have, and it helps me, it aids me. It's like a catalyst for helping me capture my art in a certain way on many levels, because it inspires me, but also, as I say, helps combat the anxiety or the apprehension that I might have.
Is that anything then also to do with this sense that in a lot of your work we've got these windows, there's a barrier? You know, people see these apertures, these windows, as spaces that we look through to access something within or without, but that also, because of the nature of the window pane, that there is a separation. I mean, are you very separate from your subject?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I mean, in terms of finding windows or a barrier, if I'm doing that, it's certainly not conscious. It may be something that I'm doing that I'm not realizing. But in terms of like windows and reflections themselves, I just simply find those interesting.
Mm.
I find reflections um, interesting in a way because they also serve, I think, as metaphors, just for art, for expression, for life. You know, it's the window into the soul or the window into something else.
Mhm.
and it helps you break another dimension. It gives you something else to work with, I think, rather than just a traditional frontal photograph. If I'm using a reflection, you still get the foreground, but then it gives you a background, and then maybe gives you an added layer of another image that you weren't even anticipating. Like when you happen to be snapping that photograph, somebody walking on the sidewalk behind me is also reflected in that picture, which makes it all the more appealing.
And
Um,
is there an element also though of like a suspension of time with this? I mean, very often, I don't mean these people are preserved in aspect, but nonetheless, there's still a sense that, for example, the lady here, she's I don't know, do your characters become doll-like because they're in the window? They're somehow suspended further from the way they could be suspended in the photograph anyway?
that's possible. Yeah, it's not something that I'm like consciously seeking out, but I think like if I were to get a picture of her not behind that door and she was just standing on the sidewalk, I think that could still be a very engrossing photograph.
Hmm.
The fact that she's standing in this cafe, Cafe Dante, and even behind the word Dante, and sort of that pose that she has, that expression, I think it adds another layer of interest. And what that mean, like, does that what's in her bag? You know, maybe she's got Inferno in her bag. Maybe she was reading it. You know, who knows?
Yeah.
It just sets a scene. It sets a particular ambiance that I think could be, but not necessarily more interesting, but could be. It adds another layer of possible discussion, or maybe another layer of a head scratcher for the viewer to maybe make he or she ponder about it a little bit longer. And I think if you can present something that makes somebody think, or makes somebody feel, or even makes somebody contemplate or discuss what it could be, then you as a creator, you as a photographer is doing he or she's job, because you're stopping somebody in their tracks for a moment and forcing them to pay attention to what you're doing, even if it's only for a split second, because there's so much information in this world and we have such little time, that if you can grab somebody's attention for a minute, I think that's a compliment. You're on the right path.
But is there also though something quite poignant about that? That there's a kind of poignancy to guiding people to something that is gone.
That like no longer exists, like a bygone era or something.
A bit of both, actually. The fact simply that, you know, stylistically, yes, I think we both would say that your work does have, or lots of people do think your work has this sense of a bygone era, but also that simply a photograph itself crystallizes a moment that is dead, that is gone.
Yeah, I think it's good. I was an archivist for a while, and I was into history for a while, studied history. So as a historian, I've always been interested in like capturing something. It's important, I think, and that's what one of the great things about photography is just a frozen moment in time, always there for someone to see. And if you can help contribute that, you can help preserve that for future generations, for future people to see. I think that that's an important thing. Another thing is, I think for a while I was, even though I'm not super old, I think I was sort of becoming like an old curmudgeon about music and things that, you know, when I was a youth or a teenager, like music now is not as good as it used to be, kind of like the past generation. So I was trying to channel that into art too, because I felt like it went beyond art. It went into film. It went into other facets of art. So I was trying to not bring it back, but at least place a stamp or put an advertisement out for this genre or this aesthetic, because I felt like, not with all things, but with some things, it's being lost a little bit. And so I was maybe trying to call attention to some people that I think otherwise might not have noticed, you know, just because they were born later, or they weren't exposed to it, or they didn't have the serendipity that I see, like having a grandmother who exposed you to these old things. That other people were raised in environments where they didn't have that, and I'm so thankful for it and glad for it, that I feel like it's my job, or at least I can make some contribution and put it out there and present it and be like, well, take a look at this and you might like this. This is cool. If you like this, you could explore this avenue yourself, or explore Miles Davis. Go listen to John Coltrane. Go look at the films of Jean-Luc Godard or the French New Wave and check it out. Maybe I piqued your interest a little bit and now you can explore it, make your own contribution, and in turn pass that down to somebody else. You know, sort of keep the ball rolling, pass it on, you know. That's sort of, I think, one of my main goals of getting involved in this at all is to honor something and to try to keep the flame burning. And then, you know, once I'm older, I pass the torch to somebody else and they can keep it going. You know, we're all a continuum. We're all interrelated somehow. So if we can just keep it going and try to spread something, which is art, which helps us, you know, cope with the pain of life, then, you know, that's a good thing. Then that's a success story in my book.
There's a quote by Cartier-Bresson, and it's photographers deal in things that are continually vanishing. And there's a kind of follow-up addendum to that that says something like, you know, the thing that vanishes will never be in existence again, but through photographs I'm paraphrasing now, but through photographs we keep it safe, or something like that. When I again prepare to meet you and I'm looking through your work, I'm looking at the page in my book where I've jotted down all my kind of loose sort of ideas and impressions that I get from your work. And one of the first things I wrote down was beatnik. I put down breathless. I also put down the sound I saw by Roy de Carava, basically jazz musicians recorded as these beautiful large format photographs as a bookwork.
Okay.
But simultaneous recognition. So these are kind of loose impressions that I've had from looking at your work. I think it's interesting that as a street photographer, I think a lot of people assume street photographers work almost exclusively in black and white and work in kind of smoky alleyways. And actually things that stand out to me in your work is very often like a luminosity and also color.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about color a little bit in your work?
Yeah. I think I never wanted to be a stranger to color, because after all, I mean, that's how we view the everyday world, is we see it in color. And so when I'm taking photographs, I'm actually shooting raw. So my photographs technically are in color. It's just later I turn them into black and white. However, I think some photographs can benefit by leaving them in color. And there's no written rule on this, or no like set filter or set direction to follow. It's just I'm using my intuition. If I just look at this photograph in color and then I look at it in black and white, if I find it more appealing, more aesthetically pleasing in black and white, or should I say color, then I hope that the viewer would also agree with me. Sometimes like color can interplay, they can have conversations with one another, and leaving that in the photograph is more beneficial. With these two here in particular that you have up, the one on the left, the gentleman with the frock coat on, I just loved that shade of his coat in the early morning sun, just as it was coming up. And I loved also the stoplight behind him, how it was similar in color. And
you have lots of relationships in your work. I mean, all through your work, actually, yellow is a theme. The color yellow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought of it until our discussion right now.
I mean, there are so many relationships to yellow.
Yeah.
That kind of ochre, gold, and even the last one. I really, sometimes, I mean, for me anyway, because my photographic specialism when I was a student was color darkroom. So color to me is very kind of important. It's especially vivid. And when I look at your work, the color work, it's yellow that is like, wow, it really, really stands out to me. Is that not a thing for you? Is that something?
It's interesting. I never was made aware of that, I think, until right now, until you brought that to my attention. I think maybe it's just because, as you know, I like black and white, but I think adding like a strong warm color like an orange or a yellow gives it some pop. It gives it something to bounce off of. And I think it can sort of just make it that more engulfing, that more engaging for the human eye.
I'd also have to ask also just about character. You know, there's a real sense sometimes that I've asked already about this idea that there's a barrier. You're kind of perhaps in the muffled inner world with the sound that you are experiencing that's then part of your process of making the images. But the characters that you capture, do you want us to know them, or do you want them to remain anonymous? You know, what are these photographs? Are these portraits?
Yeah, no, I think I want them to remain more anonymous. I mean, all of these people, with a couple of rare exceptions, I've never seen before in my life. I don't know them. It's just capturing that moment in time when, you know, both of our pathways just converged, and I just saw it, and I had my camera and I took it. So I don't really know the actual stories of these individuals, but the photograph itself can tell a story. Of course, it's not always the same story for every viewer. You can have as many different stories attributed to this photograph as eyes that look at them.
Yeah,
But
from your Charlie Stringer interview, you said something that I thought was very profound. You said truth is in the perception of the viewer.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because when I look at a particular photograph, it can mean something to me, and I can make sense of it, but it might not necessarily what you or someone else sees in that photograph. It could mean a different mood. Like looking at this gentleman on the left here, you know, for me, it looked like he was packing heat, like he might have had a handgun coming out, you know, whereas somebody else might just think, oh, his hands are cold, or he might be reaching for his pack of cigarettes, or he might be reaching for a love letter, which he had just written that he's going to give to his sweetheart. Like, who knows what's going on or what comes to mind. And I like that, but it's, as long as it conveys something interesting.
Is this the same man who appears in the bra photograph?
Which photograph?
It's a photograph of a bra shop, and there's a man in front of it, and it looks like the same man. Is it the same man?
No, I mean, if it is, it's entirely incidental, but I don't think it's the same man, only because those photographs were taken in different sessions, different times when I was visiting, and just.
I'd love for you to look back at that photograph.
Yeah, I shall.
Goodness, that is the same person.
Oh, okay, that'd be amazing. I mean, it would be sheer coincidence, which not probable, but not impossible either. You know, who knows? So it's possible, but no, like these people are just, they happen to be there in that moment, and they were there in that moment for a reason, at least for my camera lens, and I was trying to capture that.
When you're putting these things out onto Instagram and you're getting feedback from your audience, from viewers, I mean, how do you feel about people reacting and responding to your work in the very positive way that they do? How do you feel about it?
Well, I think it's wonderful. I mean, it's flattering that, to know that your work generates just a response from somebody means that they're at least paying attention to it, and they're considering it, and they're taking the time out of their busy lives to look at it. So in that regard, I think it's wonderful. On the other hand, I'm not doing it. I'm not searching for flattery. It's more, I'm doing it because I feel like I have to do it. It's an outlet. It's a form of expression. It's how I interpret the world. It's how I deal with the world. And I feel like it's something that I'm passionate about, and something that I have a talent for in my own way. And so I'm going to put it out there. And if somebody else can get some enjoyment out of it, then all the better. You know, so again, I welcome it, but it's not something I'm chasing after.
I've put this one up now. I didn't put this on my original notes to you, actually. I put it on later, and it was because I was looking back over your Instagram account, and this one stood out to me anyway visually, but it stood out even more when I realised what you'd written with it. You'd said, I was entranced by her stoic and confident expression, um,
Yeah.
that looked right through the camera lens. This is actually quite an unusual photograph for you, would you say?
Yeah, I would say it's a little more atypical than some of my other ones. That was just one where we both were just walking in the same direction, and I was just struck by her stature. Sort of, she had an air about her, a
Mm.
certain presence, and then I loved her hat as well, and
Hello.
just and her gaze into the lens. I just thought was great, and I love how it plays off the crosswalk box in the back that's yellow, and then you've got the yellow cab
Mm.
on the other side. And so those colors play off each other. And that's why I chose to leave that one in color versus black and white, because I felt like all those colors really sort of tied it together and made it more interesting.
Do you ever have any problems with confrontation between you and your the people that you encounter?
Oh, I've definitely have had people like question what my intentions were. Um, I've definitely had some verbal confrontations and even one physical altercation where I kind of got a black eye that I actually talk about. I made this recently. I made this 6-minute film, the 6-minute documentary that I put up on my page, and I talk about it at the very end. But generally speaking, 95% of the people that I come in contact with don't really do anything one way or the other, which is what I prefer, because I want to remain as anonymous as possible. I'm not there for them to see me,
Mm.
to get their attention. I'm there to capture them. So if I don't say anything or they don't say anything, that's the best outcome. Then there's like another 4% or so that notice it and actually like it, because some people like to be on camera or like to be in the limelight or be exposed. And then there's that 1% that don't.
Mm.
And then of those, occasionally you'll have somebody that might say something nasty or just let you know, um, in no uncertainty, that they don't want to be in that situation and they don't appreciate it. And I've had a couple of those, and I just see that as an occupational hazard. That's just going to come with the territory. But it's very rare, and as I say, the good things far outweigh the bad things. The good experiences far outweigh the bad experiences.
I mean, after you've made pictures of any of these people, do you ever have proper conversations with them? Do you engage with them in in a more direct way?
Only if they want to talk to me, if they want to chat to me, and occasionally that happens. But generally speaking, it's just that frozen moment in time, those 2 or 3 seconds we were together or in each other's presence, and I took a photograph, and that was it. There wasn't any discussion or any form of communication after that, except maybe some type of eye contact or um, body expression, body language, which is very conversational. You can learn a lot just from body language, but verbally there's very little. There's very little follow up or any verbal exchange after I take the photograph.
Mm. Well, you mentioned your film. We can watch it again for uh, especially my students. I would like you to watch Taylor's film. It says on it that it's an ongoing thing. It's like part one. When
Yes, part one. I'm actually
particular
yeah,
moment.
I'm actually in the midst of making part two now. I hope to post that up in the next month or so. And I want to like continue these little mini films, almost kind of like trailers of sorts, and post one, every 2 or 3 months or so, because I'm not an aspiring filmmaker or anything, but I think it's just good because it helps document a little bit. It gives one a different perspective or a different angle of a street photographer's experience, and seeing the little film I think can be insightful and perhaps enjoyable for some.
Mm. Well, it was for me. I think what I noticed again thinking about impressions before having met you and spoken to you, that there is such a strong filmic quality to your photographs. There is definitely kind of noir. There's like the French New Wave. There's lots of kind of film references. You've cited those yourself anyway. Um,
Yeah, sure.
it was interesting watching your moving image, your actual film, to think about kind of fragments of time or experience. I'm wondering about you as Taylor present in any of these things. Obviously, you're the maker, you're the creator of these things, but you're awfully oblique as the presence, even in the film. What's that about?
How it's like kind of discombobulated a little bit. There's no like direct timeline,
No,
or
I
how.
just mean that for someone who has such a strong visual presence, that you turn the volume down on yourself considerably. Like, we don't get much purchase on you, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that just goes to my personality and the way I'm wired a little bit. I don't like to be in the limelight all that often. For me, it's far more interesting because I'm with myself all the time, so I'm far more interested in other people. I find that a lot more engaging, and I just like to capture other people and intersperse myself in it a little bit here and there, little sprinklings. But if it's all about me, then I don't find that very interesting, and then I feel like other people wouldn't find it very interesting. So I feel like my niche, my purpose is to go out and document other people. um, and I feel like that's what I could bring to the table. But I can um, you know, bring in some things like with my film, and occasionally I'll do a self-portrait, or I'm in a photograph a little bit, maybe in a reflection or something. So I think there is a time and place for that. I just think for me, I just feel like I want to do that sparingly. I'm not a selfie guy,
No.
not my gig,
I was
you
going to
know.
say, even the photographs we can see in your Instagram feed, for example, where you are present, like I said, there's still not a sense that you can really get a good hold of you. That you are vague. You're vague. And yet this other thing that you do, these photographs you make, this visual imprint you leave, is so incredibly powerful and stylized. And it's kind of like, I say to students all the time, they always know when something that's written is mine, because my handwriting is so dysfunctional and obvious that belongs to me. They recognize it. If you had a Taylor Coble photograph lying around in the studio at my school, we'd all be able to say, oh, that's Taylor's, because it's so distinctive, it belongs to you. But then your own presence, the other presence, is so quiet. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it must be the yin and the yang, sort of. They balance each other out, maybe. I also think just in various art mediums, for me, I find that a lot of the works that I find most engaging have an element of mystery to them. It's not all spelled out for you. It makes you work a little bit. It makes you wonder. It makes you formulate ideas and opinions and theories. And I find that's a lot more interesting than if somebody directly gives you the answer. Then it kind of becomes anticlimactic. There's nothing else to work for. It's all right there for you.
Mm.
I find that um, just not as fun, not as engrossing if it's something just little bits and pieces. Like, I guess when I'm thinking of like filmmakers or short story writers or novels or something, when they sort of have an open-ended ending, it's far more interesting. Like Breathless, for instance, like
Mm.
Godard's first film. That when I saw that film, that just floored me. That just really had a big impact on me. And I think in some ways, since I've been taking photographs, I've been trying to be a form of Godard in photography. I'm trying to capture, I think, what he was trying, which he did capture in that just groundbreaking film. But the ending, the whole film, it's not really you need to see it a few times to really decipher what's going on, and particularly the ending. You don't know really what happens, and it's like some of the best short stories I've read. They always have an open ending to them, or even like in music, some of the lyricists, like some of the great Bob Dylan works of the mid '60s. They're very cryptic. They're very hard to get a handle on. And he's been asked himself what they mean. And he says, I don't know. You tell me what they mean. Perhaps you might have a better answer. So you may channel something as an artist and you don't really know. You know that there's elements there. Maybe the whole puzzle is put there. All the pieces are there, but you yourself as an artist don't know how to put it together. You can just sort of put the pieces out there and let other people put it together in their own way.
It's interesting you use a phrase like spell it out, because actually there's a whole thing really that I notice again in your work that I'd like to ask you about, which is to do with the signage. You know, you photograph signage. I think there's maybe not any photograph that I would class as street photography of yours that doesn't include some kind of lettering or number or something typographical in some way. Are you conscious of that?
A little more, I think I do. I love just various fonts. I love symbols and words. I mean, I used to try my hand at writing too. I was really into reading for a while, and I love signage because signage can mean so many different things. You know, if it says don't walk, you know, it means don't walk. But if you have a photograph that says don't walk and then you see a bunch of people walking, then that could mean something else. It means like swimming against the current, or counterculture, or anti-authoritarian, or something. You know, it could have some political message. It could have some artistic message. It could be, oh, this is just simply an aesthetically pleasing photograph. But if you can have more elements in there, then to me, then you're onto something a little more happening.
Yeah, it just seems that your work is at once immediately accessible. Like, I'm sure there are many people who are looking on Instagram and they see your work and they're able to engage with it immediately. It's something that is like, wow, here's this beautiful looking document. It's a document of something that has happened. But at the same time, there's also this kind of cryptic, ironic, extremely sophisticated visual language being used. I mean, the fact that even you said yourself, you know, maybe the Inferno's in her bag, you know, there are so many clues that give us so many stories. Up to a point, it's maybe difficult to think that that is accidental on your part.
Yeah, I think there's probably more going on, but when I'm in that moment, I think when I'm taking photographs, I'm in a different zone. I'm in a different dimension. It's almost like being on a drug. I mean, I don't ingest in drugs when I go on these tangents, but it's almost like I enter a new dimension, and I think part of that is fueled, as I say earlier, about the music, and I sort of get in this particular trance that helps me accomplish in the moment when I'm trying to accomplish. It's almost like an out of body experience a little bit, or I'm somebody else capturing these, because often I'll literally be on the streets for a 24-hour period, taking photographs to the point where I'm a little delirious. And only days later, when I'm sifting through these photographs or revisiting my slides, I'm like, wow, I took that. I was in that situation. It's almost like I'm reviewing sometimes the work of somebody else, which is kind of surreal. But when I'm in that moment, it's more of a it's more visceral. You know, it's more instinct than intellect. If there's intellect involved, it's more subconscious. You know, it's a visceral thing. It's instinct. And if I gravitate towards signage or words or numbers in there, that's instinct, because it's just something that I naturally go for and I find interesting. But I'm not that in that moment aware of it. I'm like, wow, that's a cool sign. I want to get that sign right now, and I want to try to get this beautiful lady in there. It just, no, it's more happenstance in the moment. And a lot of it's serendipity too. You know, things pop up because I take a lot of photographs, and I will say that, you know, most of it is never used. Most of it I would never publish it because I don't see it fit to be published. So there is a numbers game, I think, too, at play here. It's like, you know, I probably only use 5% of what I take at best, you know. So there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of trial and error going on.
Have you always shot that way? I mean, as a photographer now, or an artist using a camera as the tool, have you always taken a lot of photographs in order to refine back or cut back? You know, what happens when you take fewer photographs?
I think just the law of averages says when I take fewer photographs, I have fewer photographs that I think are redeemable, that I think are worthy. So if I take 100 photographs, I'll have 5 that are good. If I take 50, I'll only have 2 or 3 that are good.
Mm.
Generally, but you know, that's not a hard fast rule, but that's just more of an average thing, I think, from my perspective anyway.
The other thing I noticed is that compositionally, your work is very exact. There's, I don't mean at all that it's formulaic, but that it does, again, is this conscious? Is it unconscious? This sort of sense that you are definitely abiding by particular ratios, spatial relationships.
I think later it's conscious. On the cutting room floor, when I'm editing, I try to get a sense of symmetry, or a sense of composition, or use of negative space. But when I'm in the moment, and the shutters are going off, I'm just trying to capture whatever I can in that moment, because you only have that moment to capture it.
Yeah.
In such a fast-paced city like New York City, New York City is not going to wait for you. You know, you got to go out there and get it. So I'm just out there trying to capture it, trying different angles, trying different ideas, trying different situations. And then later in the cutting room floor is, I feel like my vision is more realized. I've said this before, I think, but I'll say it again. I think I'm a better editor than I am an actual photographer. I think a lot of it comes into fruition. It comes into something greater or more coherent or cohesive when I'm editing, and when I have time to really sit with and craft what I want to present, or what I visually want to say.
In
And
terms,
so that's why I think I'm not a very good photographer. For instance, say I was paired up with like 3 or 4 other street photographers, and we were given 3 hours, just unleashed in New York City. We could take as many photographs as we want, and we were using like an analog camera, like a Pentax K1000 or something, you know, film photography, and there was no editing allowed. And we went to the dark room, and we worked with our photographs. I would wager that I would be in last place of all of those photographers in terms of interesting imagery, or what you might call proper photography. But on the other hand, if we were then allowed to go in as editors and crop and do whatever we want, I think I may be first place in terms of being successful in editing. But as a photographer, as I say, from looking at it through the lens of a conventional, educated, sort of orthodox photographer, I don't really think I can be pigeonholed that way.
I think that's a conversation really about what photography is. You know, I would say that an editor is as much the photographer now as the person who is at that kind of inceptive moment. You know, whether you agree with that as a principle of photography or not. I mean, there's lots of traditionalists and purists who would say, well, you know, a photographer is somebody who can take a good photograph in a single shot. But
Right.
if there's an acceptance that photography is rapidly changed in the last 20 years. It's a young art anyway, and that we accept that being a great editor is in actual fact the same the same craft, part of the same craft process anyway.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's benefited me of being actually sort of born when I was born,
Mm,
because, now I think a lot, Photoshop and all these other tools are vastly accepted and used and seen as part of the necessary process. But, say I was living, the 1950s right now, trying to take photographs.
mm.
I don't think I would be as successful. And I also think it benefits me actually living in the era that I live in, because I'm tapping into a niche that not everybody follows, and that is trying to bring about and trying to capture maybe a bygone era or a vintage look, which a lot of people, I mean, not a lot of people, but some people, I would say, find interesting. And that's maybe separates me from the pack or makes me a little bit more of a maverick. And that way, if I was living in the 50s and just capturing everyday life, which looks vintage to us now, but I would be just taking photographs, in real time, and not having the benefit of being able to easily edit like we do now. I don't think I would have much of a leg to stand on. I don't think I would have a lot to offer.
It's interesting to me listening. I mean, listening to you talking to Charlie Pinder was interesting in itself, because that was really my first experience of hearing you speak about your work. But I understand where it comes from, but I was surprised at how self-conscious you did seem about admitting, for example, that you often are taking these photographs using just your iPhone. Um,
Yeah,
and I have a lot of conversations with people, um, colleagues and students, about like the value of kit, of cameras, of technical stuff, things you can purchase to make your craft better. And
right.
I know that there's lots of discussion about, does a camera make a good photographer? Well, we all know, of course, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I know a lot of I have a lot of people who write me who get caught up in the equipment side of it and ask me what kind of camera do you use? What lens do you use? And I'm just like, honestly, a lot of these are just shot with my iPhone 11, because that's all I had on at the time. That's what I had with me. And for
And
me,
I
it worked.
tell you, though, that you are in actual fact seeing a beautiful photograph.
When I
Yeah,
look at oh,
yeah,
you mean in the moment?
yeah.
I think I'm seeing something that I find engaging and interesting. So I hope that translates for somebody else as well. But I will find that often, I think this is probably true of a lot of people, like in the moment where you're taking, you're like, this is going to be one of my best. And then you go later and revisit it, and it doesn't end up being one of your best. And then another one, conversely, where you were taking it and you were just like, I don't know, I'll just take it. It ends up being one of your best. So it's hard to know. It's hard to predict what's going to be really good, or to premeditate a situation that's really going to be good.
Mm.
I'm just in the moment. I'm trying to capture something, and later I'll revisit and I'll have final cut on it, and figure out what I think is good.
I'm going to come full circle back to where I really started, going back to this idea of painting and printmaking. Uh, are your photographs visually similar to paintings that you would make?
Yes and no. I think they're similar in that they both capture what I'm going for. But I was a far vastly inferior painter. I could see in my mind what I wanted, but I didn't have the rendering with the brush to produce what the envision in my mind, because I'm not that great of a painter. But with photography, I'm able to do that because the camera produces that image that I saw, that I was there,
Mm.
and I'm able to work with it. Whereas with painting, I'll have something in my mind that really looks good, but I'm not able to replicate that on the canvas, just because I don't have that skill with a brush. I don't have the skill that's required of a good painter. So switching mediums for me was a revelation, and you know, it was only in hindsight where I was like, I should have pursued photography, not painting. But you know, hindsight's always 2020. I didn't know that, you know, at the time, but I also think there was a benefit for me being in painting, because I think it still informs the way I look at images, the way I look at composition,
Mm.
and the things that I'm going after when I'm in the streets shooting photography.
So then this leads me to my last question, which is really for all our aspiring photographers, our young street photographers, um, what would you say makes a great photograph?
I think if you can evoke emotion or evoke a question from the viewer when they see that photograph, if it makes them feel something or ask something or contemplate something, then that's a success. Furthermore, I'll say if the photograph tells some type of story, tells a fable, or illustrates some situation that one finds engrossing or one that somebody can relate to, then you've succeeded, and that particular photograph has succeeded, at least on some level. You know, I think the worst thing is that somebody looks at a photograph and they feel nothing, and they don't look at it again and never think about it again and forget about it,
Mm.
because that didn't leave an impact and it didn't really serve its purpose. I would see that as a failure as a photograph.
Taylor Coble, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Well, thank you, Sandy. It was lovely talking with you. Appreciate you taking the time to interview me.
Very insightful feedback for me as somebody who loves your photographs, really admires them. And also I think for my students looking at what it means to be a photographer, what it is to be a street photographer as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Bye.
Take care.